When was the last time you thought about the Third Amendment? Take a second now and see if you can even remember which amendment the third is. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. Chances are you've thought about the Third Amendment never. It's one of the least litigated provisions of the U.S. Constitution. It says that in peacetime, soldiers cannot be quartered in private homes without the owner's consent. Most people treat the Third Amendment like a constitutional oddity, a historical relic. But the reason for that is that it was completely uncontroversial. It's arguably the constitutional amendment with the clearest definitions and the most uncontroversial premise. The government can't station soldiers in your house. Even in these modern times of deep political divisions within the United States, you'd have a hard time finding somebody that would disagree with that premise. At the same time, the reasons that the Third Amendment are so uncontroversial helps explain something that the Trump administration never has really understood about NATO. Now, to be clear, the Third Amendment does not directly govern NATO at all. In fact, it predates NATO by almost 200 years. It doesn't tell us what our relationship with Germany, Italy, Poland, Romania, Spain, or the United Kingdom should look like. But it does reflect a principle that Americans once understood very, very clearly. The presence of foreign troops on your sovereign territory is a profound political and social imposition. And once you understand that, you start to see why the Trump administration's complaints about NATO are really obtuse. For years, we've heard the same refrain out of the Republican Party, and particularly out of the Trump administration. Europe doesn't spend enough on its own defense. NATO allies are not paying their fair share. America is getting ripped off. Now, there may be a narrow point there. Some NATO countries probably should invest more in their own defense, their troops, their equipment, their readiness, and their defense industries. But that is only one side of the balance sheet, because what America receives from NATO is not just money. It's access, it's geography, it's permission. Because of NATO, the United States enjoys basing rights across Europe because sovereign nations allow us to maintain forces, facilities, aircraft, logistics networks, ammunition, intelligence platforms, and command structures on their sovereign territory. That is not a minor benefit. In fact, it is one of the most important foundations of American power projection. I mean, imagine trying to reinforce Europe, deter Russia, evacuate Americans from the Middle East, support operations in Africa, or provide humanitarian relief after a disaster without access to European bases. I deployed to the Middle East many times when I was on active duty, and never once did I not stop somewhere in Europe on the way. Without NATO, we would have to move everything from the continental United States itself, or negotiate temporary access during every single crisis. That would be slower, more expensive, less reliable, and far more dangerous to the United States and everyone else. The forward presence of the American military changes everything about international relations. It allows America to respond before a crisis becomes a catastrophe. It allows us to deter adversaries before a war even begins. It allows us to sustain operations that would otherwise be logistically impossible. That access is inordinately valuable to the United States. Now, it may be difficult to quantify in dollars and cents, but strategically, it is indispensable. And yet, when the Trump administration talks about NATO, they act as if the only contribution that counts is a percentage of GDP spent on defense. That is an absurdly narrow view of the alliance. Because our allies are not merely buying tanks. They are permitting the United States to project military power from their sovereign territory. That permission has value, enormous value. And it also carries a huge cost. This is where the Third Amendment gives us some perspective. The Third Amendment was not adopted because quartering soldiers was merely inconvenient. It reflected a deep political grievance. Americans understood deep in their core that the presence of foreign troops amongst their civilian populations was not just a military fact. It was a question of national sovereignty. It was a question of self-government. In fact, it was a question of national identity. It was a question of whether people felt like they controlled their own country. Now, obviously, our NATO allies are not occupied territories in the traditional sense. American troops are not in Europe as conquerors. They are there by treaty, by invitation, by mutual agreement among democratic nations. And that distinction does matter. But it does not erase the underlying political reality. Every democratic government that hosts American forces has to answer to its own people. Why are there foreign troops here? Why are American bases operating on our soil? Why are military exercises happening in our communities? What risks do these installations create? What happens if the United States starts a conflict, escalates a conflict, or draws retaliation toward our territory? Who is responsible if and when American servicemen interrupt the lives of the local populations? Those are real questions, and our allies absorb those political costs every day. Their leaders spend domestic political capital maintaining relationships that are enormously beneficial to the United States. That political capital does not calculate neatly on a NATO spending chart, but it matters a lot. So when the Trump administration reduces NATO to a crude financial transaction, it misrepresents the core of the relationship. It misses the value of access. It misses the value of trust. It obfuscates the value of permission. And it ignores the massive burdens that our allies accept by hosting American power on their sovereign soil. The Third Amendment reminds us that Americans once found the presence of foreign troops on our soil so sensitive that we wrote a constitutional protection against it. Today, some of our closest allies voluntarily bear a version of that same burden, not because they're weak, not because they're taking advantage of us, but because they believe that the alliance makes the world safer. The least that we can do is recognize that hosting American power is itself one of the most valuable contributions that they make. And we should think twice about petulant requests for our allies to spend more of their GDP on defense when they are already giving us so much.